There are places in this world where silence behaves differently, where it seems to hover above the ground like a thin veil, as if waiting for someone to notice what has always been hiding beneath it. Tonight, we step into 3 such silences scattered across a continent: a carved figure buried in a royal tomb, a serpent made of moving sunlight, and a metropolis so vast its creators remain strangers to us. Alone, each site seems like an oddity, a beautiful accident. But together, they begin to form the outline of a map not of rivers or roads, but of visitations, the kind that come from above. It begins in the lowland jungles of Chiapas, where the air is thick and humid, and where the ruins of Palenque rise like the bones of a forgotten creature. Here, in 1952, beneath a pyramid hiding a staircase stuffed deliberately with rubble, archaeologists found the tomb of a king, and upon the lid of that tomb, they found him Paco the Great, not standing tall as rulers often prefer to be remembered, not seated proudly among symbols of power, but leaning forward into what looks uncannily like a machine. His hands hover over panels that resemble controls. His feet brace against something like pedals. His face is framed by tubing that seems to channel air toward his nose. His entire body is wrapped in motion, a motion not downward toward death, but upward, toward the sky. You can dismiss it as coincidence, as artistic flourish, but the detail remains. The precision remains, and the posture remains, unmistakable and strangely modern, as though someone carved what they saw, not what they imagined. From the dark chamber in Palenque, we move hundreds of miles north to the sunlit plains of the Yucatan. Here, the pyramid of Kukulkan stands with a confidence that only geometry could dream of. Its symmetry alone is enough to unsettle the mind. 4 staircases, each with 91 steps, summing to the sacred number of the solar year, terraces that catch the afternoon sun at an angle so perfect that twice a year a serpent of light begins to descend. 7 triangular shadows merge one into another, slithering downward until they meet the carved stone head of a feathered serpent waiting at the base. To say the effect is theatrical would be an understatement. It is orchestrated, engineered, deliberate, a message rendered not in words but in alignment. You can call it a calendar entering performance mode, but there is something haunting in the timing, something ceremonial and remembered, as if the spectacle reenacts an event rather than symbolizing one. And for a fleeting moment each year, the boundary between myth and mechanism blurs. From that pyramid of shifting light, the path drifts westward to the shadowed avenues of Teotihuacán, a city so old the people who built it had already disappeared when the Aztecs arrived, staring at the pyramids with a fear that resembled reverence. A city whose name, the place where gods were born, was not given by its architects but by those who inherited the silence. Its central road runs straight toward the horizon with mathematical precision, flanked by structures that seem to mimic constellations. Yet no king's name is inscribed on its walls. No boastful records, no narrative carved into stone. It is as though the builders did not need to immortalize themselves, because they were never meant to be remembered in the first place. 3 places, 3 pieces, each separated by distance, era, and culture, and yet each echoes the same unspoken idea, the idea of contact. A man carved in mid-ascent, a serpent built from sunlight, a city arranged like a celestial diagram. If these were merely coincidences, they would remain isolated curiosities, but they multiply, they repeat, they intensify. They appear in forms too structured, too astronomical, too impossibly aligned to be dismissed as folklore carved into stone. Instead, they begin to resemble signatures left behind by hands that do not match our own. There is a moment in every great mystery when the details stop whispering and begin to converge, when the symbols start pointing in the same direction, when the story is no longer about one artifact or one pyramid, but about a pattern, one that stretches across centuries, speaking a language older than any surviving script. And when we look closely, something remarkable happens. The noise of history fades, and what remains is a faint but deliberate outline, a kind of cartography drawn not on parchment, but on the earth itself. Consider the strange continuity. Mesoamerican mythologies describe beings descending from the sky, sometimes as serpents, sometimes as people, sometimes as shapes wrapped in fire. Their arrival is often accompanied by light or sound, their departure followed by promises to return. And the monuments built around those stories are not crude symbols. They are engineered phenomena. They involve mathematics, sound physics, solar mechanics, and knowledge of planetary cycles that modern astronomers still marvel at. What does that imply? It implies that the ancients were not simply storytellers embellishing natural events. They were observers. They saw something, and they built in order to remember. This is where the silent map begins to reveal its purpose. Not as a record of what humans dreamed, but of what humans witnessed. And when you place Palenque beside Chichén Itzá, and Chichén Itzá beside Teotihuacán, a picture begins to form, a picture of visitations occurring not once, but repeatedly, a picture of teachers descending, interacting, instructing, and then vanishing, leaving behind structures that serve as both memory and message. Yet the ancients did not draw these messages in ink. They carved them into the ground. They designed them to move with the sun, to echo with sound, to align with stars, because they knew that paper burns, that stories change, that languages die. but stone endures. And so tonight, we follow this map, this silent atlas of impossible structures and celestial alignments, ask the question that hovers behind every shadow, every beam of sun, every carved feather and scaled serpent. If these places are markers, then what, or who, were they marking? Before we move deeper, take a moment to breathe. Look at where you are sitting. Look at the time. Then imagine someone thousands of years from now doing the same, trying to understand us through what we leave behind. What patterns would they see? What stories would they tell? Because what we are uncovering now is not merely the past. It is the trace of a relationship between humanity and something older, higher, and far more patient than we ever imagined. If you stand before El Castillo at Chichén Itzá, just as the afternoon sun begins its slow descent, you will notice something subtler: sharpness in the shadows, crispness in the angles, a sense that the pyramid is not merely reflecting sunlight but interacting with it. Most structures absorb light. Others scatter it. But this one seems to choreograph it, as though every stone were placed in anticipation of a moment that only arrives twice a year. It is in those moments, on the spring and autumn equinoxes, that the pyramid reveals its true nature, not as a monument to power, but as a mechanism. To understand it, imagine losing everything we know today about astronomy, geometry, engineering. No satellites, no clocks, Now imagine trying to build something capable of tracking the sun's journey so precisely that a single shadow, cast at a single angle, behaves like a living creature. That is what the Maya achieved, and it forces us to ask a question that grows heavier with each measurement. Were they merely brilliant, or were they remembering something that had been shown to them? Look closely at the pyramid's northern staircase. 91 steps on each of its 4 sides, 364 in total plus the summit platform, giving the exact count of the solar year. Above them rise 9 terraces that cast 9 distinct shadow planes. To most visitors, these are just architectural choices. But during the equinox, as the sun slips toward the horizon, the terraces begin to perform. Triangular shadows sharpen, lengthen, and stitch themselves together until they form the unmistakable pattern of a serpent slithering down the staircase. When the shadow touches the giant stone serpent head at the base, the illusion becomes whole. For a brief window only minutes long, the pyramid transforms. Some say it is symbolism. Others call it spectacle, but symbolism rarely requires this level of precision. Spectacle rarely demands this level of patience. This is not just a metaphor carved in stone. It is design. It is calculation. It is choreography on a planetary scale. And when you add the serpent's Quetzalcoatl, the feathered god who descended from the sky, the performance begins to resemble something else entirely, a reenactment. Archaeologists offer a grounded explanation. They speak of agricultural cycles, ritual calendars, solar tracking, and they are not wrong. The pyramid is undeniably a calendar in stone, but calendars do not typically require theatrical serpents made of moving light. Calendars do not require acoustic chambers. Calendars do not require foundations built atop an underground lake believed to be a portal to the underworld. The Maya were not guessing at the cosmos, they were engaging with it. And perhaps more importantly, they were memorializing an encounter. Because the pyramid does more than speak in light, it speaks in sound. Stand at the base of the staircase and clap your hands. The echo that returns is not the sound you sent out. It is a sharp chirpa, perfect mimicry of the call of the Quetzal, the sacred bird whose feathers crown the serpent god. Imagine thousands of people standing around the plaza, chanting, clapping, creating a symphony of engineered echoes aligned with the setting sun. This is not accidental. This is architecture behaving like a musical instrument, tuned to produce a voice the Maya believed belonged to their god. But the most unsettling detail lies beneath the pyramid itself. In 2016, scientists using electrical resistivity tomography discovered that the entire structure was built atop a Sonodian underground sinkhole filled with water. To the Maya, these were portals, not metaphors, not allegories, portals. The sky above, the earth in the middle, the watery underworld below, and the pyramid sat at the exact intersection of these realms, as if deliberately planted to anchor the three-tiered universe. A cosmic axis, a landing point, a transmitter. This is where the sci-fi flavor of the mystery sharpens. Because when we view El Castillo purely as a temple, its precision feels extravagant. But when we view it as a machine-on instrument built to recreate an event, to honor a descent, or perhaps to guide one, the extravagance becomes a necessity. The light must fall perfectly. The sound must echo precisely. The placement must align cosmically. Everything about it suggests intention. And if intention exists, the next question emerges naturally. Intention? For what? Some researchers whisper of encoded messages, mathematical signatures designed to outlast languages. Others propose the pyramid as a ritual beacon, marking dates of return. And then there are those who look beyond symbolism and ask whether the Serpent of Light is not just a story told by stone, but a memory of something witnessed, a craft descending, a form slithering down from the heavens, a presence the people could only describe as serpentine because it moved with fluidity and brilliance beyond their vocabulary. In that interpretation, the equinox is not a symbolic performance, it is a reenactment of an arrival. You can reject the interpretation, you can hold firmly to the mainstream explanation and find comfort in it. But even then, the puzzle pieces remain. Why construct a pyramid that tells time in 3 different cycles? Why align it with both the sun and a subterranean lake? Why tune its steps to mimic a sacred bird? And most importantly, why design a monument that transforms before human eyes only during celestial thresholds? It is as though the Maya wanted future generations to witness exactly what they witnessed to see, what they saw descending that staircase of light. And this is only the beginning. Because as mysterious as Kukulkan's pyramid is, it is not the only structure that behaves like a machine. It is not the only artifact that depicts beings descending from above. And it is not the only place where myth and engineering merge seamlessly into a single story. If El Castillo is the first point on our silent map, then the second lies deeper in the jungle, carved into limestone and sealed beneath centuries of earth. A story of ascension, not descent. A story etched into a single stone slab that still confounds archaeologists and astrophysicists alike. A story that suggests the Maya did not just watch the heavens, they may have traveled toward them. And that is where we go next. The jungle has a way of protecting its secrets. It grows over stone, swallows staircases, erases footprints, and smothers ruins until the past becomes nothing more than a rumor carried by the wind. But every so often, the ground opens, sometimes literally, and what emerges is not a relic of ancient myth, but something far stranger, a story that feels modern, technological, almost futuristic. Palenque is one of those places, and inside its most sacred chamber lies a carving that has unsettled the imagination of the world for more than half a century. It was 1952 when archaeologist Alberto Ruz Lulier removed a stone slab from the floor of the Temple of the Inscriptions. Beneath it, he found a narrow passageway packed deliberately with rubble, as though someone wanted the staircase hidden, perhaps even forgotten. It took years to clear. When he finally reached the bottom, he found a massive limestone door sealed for over a millennium. And when that door opened, the chamber revealed a tomb unlike any other in Mesoamerica, the resting place of Chichén Itzá, the so-called sun shield. The room shimmered in the torchlight. Jade beads, carved shells, red pigment, but none of that compared to the sarcophagus lid itself, a colossal stone slab over 12 feet long, 5 tons in weight, carved with an image. So densely packed with symbols, so violently detailed that it radiated a narrative no one seemed prepared to interpret. To traditional archaeologists, the scene is clear. Pakal is shown falling from, or entering the jaws of the underworld. Framed by the sacred world tree, surrounded by symbols of death, rebirth, and cosmic cycles. It is a spiritual portrait, they say a reflection, of a king's journey through the afterlife. But when the Swiss writer, Erich von Däniken, saw the same image, he did not see death. He saw launch. Look closely, not with the intention to believe, but simply to observe. Pakal is reclined, but not limply. His back is arched as if resisting the force pushing him upward. His hands are not open in surrender. They are poised, gripping, manipulating. His right hand hovers above what appears to be a complex array of controls, small detailed components that resemble switches or dials. His left arm reaches toward a level-like object. His feet brace against a multi-level platform that looks uncomfortably similar to modern pedals. And then there is the object surrounding him. The structure behind his head resembles a headdress. The lines below him resemble fuel exhaust stylized flames, elongated and directional. Tubes run to his nose. Symbols that archaeologists interpret as mythological breath adornments take on an entirely different character when viewed through another lens. They become conduits. They become airflow systems. They become technology. You can argue that this is coincidence, a trick of modern imagination projected onto ancient art, but coincidence becomes harder to justify when so many details align. The composition itself forces upward motion. The border framing the scene is filled with celestial symbols, the sun, the moon, Venus suggesting the setting, is not the underworld, but the sky. Even his name, Chichén Itzá, translates loosely to radiant sun shield. For a spiritual ruler, a powerful name. For a skyfarer, something else entirely. Pakal's physical remains add another layer to the mystery. He lived to be around 80 years old, an extraordinary age for his time, far beyond the normal life expectancy of the Maya elite. His bones indicate a frame slighter and less robust than the typical aristocracy. And strangely, his skull shows no evidence of the deliberate cranial deformation performed on Maya royalty, a mark of divine lineage. It is as though he came from somewhere else, or was considered something else. And this is where the narrative begins to sway not toward fantasy, but toward a question. Why would an entire civilization carve such a technologically evocative scene if the concept of machinery did not exist to them? Why choose this posture, this complexity, this upward thrust? Why choose tubing, levers, controls? The Maya were not whimsical artists. Their iconography is systematic, deliberate, and symbolic. Every line has meaning. Every motif has precedent. And yet the Pakal carving has no parallel in Maya art. Nowhere else do we find a king depicted in such a dynamic, mechanical pose. Nowhere else do we see a tableau so dramatically divorced from typical portrayals of death, unless this was not mythology at all, but memory. A memory of a man or, perhaps, a being not descending into darkness, but ascending into light. Imagine for a moment that Quetzalcoatl was not being lowered into the jaws of the earth monster, but lifted by a vehicle whose shape the Maya struggled to describe. Imagine that this image captures the moment of a departure, a farewell carved in stone so that generations would remember that a ruler once took to the sky, not as a metaphor, but as an event. If this interpretation feels impossible, consider this. Throughout the ancient world, myth after myth describes visitors descending from above, sometimes in fiery chariots, sometimes in shining boats, sometimes on beams of light. And what do we find in Palenque? A king portrayed not as a passive voyager to the underworld, but as an operator, a participant, an active traveler. This carving becomes the second point on our silent map, a point that hints at a civilization attempting to translate the untranslatable, a moment where ancient eyes saw something extraordinary and preserved it in the only form available to them: art. But art, unlike language, cannot lie the same way. It cannot rewrite itself through translation. It captures not intention, but impression. And when an impression resembles a launch sequence more than a funeral ritual, it forces us to rethink what the Maya truly believed happened to their king. Perhaps Quetzalcoatl was revered not because he journeyed into death, but because he journeyed into the sky. Perhaps the myths of sky gods descending are paired with a myth that has been hiding in plain sight, a human ascending. And if he ascended, then where did he go? The answer may lie not in the tombs of Palenque but in patterns carved across Mesoamerica, patterns we have only begun to unravel, because the Maya did not simply depict the sky. They measured it, they mastered it, they encoded it into calendars that span entire ages. And somewhere within those cycles may lie the reason Quetzalcoatl was shown traveling upward, not downward. Our map expands, the symbols shift, and now the sky is no longer a backdrop, it becomes a destination. There are cities where history is whispered in broken pottery, where memory clings to the faded pigments of ancient murals, where the past can be pieced together like a mosaic. But Copán is not one of those places. Copán does not whisper. It stands before you like a monolith of silence, vast and deliberate, as if guarding something it cannot allow us to fully read. And at the heart of its silence lies a staircase, 72 stone steps, rising like a frozen waterfall, each one carved with story, prophecy, lineage, and power. A staircase that should have been a book that was shattered. To walk along the base of the hieroglyphic stairway is to stand before the longest written text in the ancient Americas, over 2,000 glyphs, meticulously carved, each one a syllable of a lost epic. This was not a casual inscription, not an artistic flourish. It was a record of kings, gods, celestial cycles, blood rituals, coronations, battles, visions, a living library. The Maya carved their mathematics with elegance, but their histories, they carved those with reverence. And yet, when archaeologists found the staircase collapsed centuries later, the glyphs were a jumbled heap, scattered, snapped, fragmented. In their haste to restore the monument, early researchers reassembled the stones the best they could, but only the bottom rows remain in their original order. Everything above them is scrambled, inverted, misplaced. Imagine a 1,000-page manuscript whose chapters have been torn apart. The pages mixed, rebound blindly, and then placed back on the shelf as if nothing happened. That is Copán's staircase. We are left with fragments of sentences, slivers of meaning. Kings appear and vanish out of sequence. Wars unfold without context. Rituals begin but never end. The library of stone, once a coherent story, no longer speaks in linear time. But if we look past the disorder, something else emerges. Something rhythmic, repeated, intentional. Kings in Copán spoke with gods. That much is clear even in the scrambled state of the text. They opened portals, not metaphorically, but ritually, through bloodletting acts that the Maya believed thinned the veil between worlds. To a modern mind, these portals may sound mystical, but the glyphs describe these rituals with an odd specificity. Serpents emerging from smoke, ancestors appearing in luminous form, beings communicating messages during celestial alignments. You can read these as metaphor, as poetry, as spiritual allegory, but some details in the glyphs carry a different energy, one that feels more procedural than religious. Offering bundles arranged in patterns, points marked by astronomical dates, the presence of staves and rods that resemble tools as much as regalia. The glyphs speak not just of receiving messages, but of operating through them. When scholars study ancient languages, they look for recurring structures, patterns that suggest grammar, form, logic. But in Copán, another pattern emerges. Repetition of imagery that resembles connection, transmission, activation. The kings are shown holding objects that flare with radiating lines. They kneel before thrones that resemble control stations. They channel entities that descend through vertical, column-like shapes. And the sky appears everywhere, not as background, but as destination. If you imagine that the Maya believed the gods lived in the heavens, this makes sense. But if you imagine they did not simply believe, but remembered, something else takes shape. What if these glyphs do not merely record devotion, but instruction? What if the kings of Copán were not claiming divine legitimacy, but documenting interaction, communication? This is where the broken narrative becomes strangely revealing. Because the story is jumbled, we cannot see it as a single orderly arc. Instead, we see motifs, echoes, a structure beneath the fractured surface, and the structure suggests two things. First, the kings believed their power came from direct contact with beings beyond the human realm. Second, the rituals they performed were attempts to recreate, maintain, or restore that contact. Now consider this. In the ancient world, knowledge was not democratized. It lived in the hands of an elite few scribes, priests, astronomers, rulers. If a civilization once experienced something extraordinary in a rival, a visitation, a descentive would not be recorded in a children's tale. It would be carved in stone and placed on the staircase of a royal acropolis, visible only to those chosen to ascend it. But the true twist is this. The staircase may once have told us exactly when and how the sky opened. And now we cannot read it. Scrambled not by nature alone, but by time, by collapse, by human error, perhaps even by deliberate design. There is a strange detail that researchers rarely emphasize. When Copán fell, it was not destroyed by fire or invaders. It simply ended. Its population thinned. Its monuments ceased. Its kingship line disappeared. As if something vital was lost, something that held the city together. If the rulers believed they were chosen through communication with the gods, then what happens to a kingdom when that communication stops? Think of a radio suddenly losing signal, a lighthouse extinguished, a compass spinning without direction. The people might lose trust. The rituals might lose meaning. The structure might collapse from the inside. And perhaps that is why the staircase is now scrambled, not because we lost the story, but because the people of Copán did too. Yet even in fragments, the glyphs retain a pulse. They gesture toward something bigger than themselves. They carry the same undertones found in Palenque, in Chichén Itzá, in Teotihuacán, an undercurrent of celestial presence. A sense that the ancient Maya were not simply observers of the heavens, but participants in a relationship that spanned generations. And so the staircase becomes the third point of our silent map. A point that once held a complete chronicle of contact and now survives only as a riddle whose pieces refuse to align. But the Maya did not rely solely on stone to encode the cosmos. They built their knowledge into time itself, into cycles so vast and precise that even modern astronomy struggles to explain how they were measured. If the staircase is a shattered memory, then the calendar unchanged, intact, indestructible is something far more unsettling. It is not myth, it is not ritual, it is mathematics. And mathematics does not lie, which means the next point on our journey is not carved in stone, but in the fabric of the sky. There is a particular kind of silence that comes with staring at the sky, one that deepens the longer you look, as if the universe is waiting to see whether you understand what you're witnessing. The ancient Maya did not just look at the sky, they measured it, they memorized it, they lived inside its cycles the way we live inside calendars, clocks, and algorithms. But the difference is stark. Our calendars measure human routine. Theirs measured cosmic rhythm. And at the center of their entire civilization, pulsing beneath every temple, every ritual, every harvest, was a system of timekeeping so vast that it challenges the limits of what a pre-telescopic society should. They've been capable of knowing. The long count calendar is often invoked in modern pop culture because of one date, December 21st, 2012. But its real significance lies not in its ending, but in its beginning. The Maya set their mythic 0 point to a moment equivalent to August 11, 3114 BCE. Why that day? Why that number? Why a count that spans 5,125 years? Because to understand precession, you must watch the stars shift by 1 degree every 72 years. No individual can observe more than a tiny fragment of this drift. No oral tradition can preserve measurements with that kind of fidelity for thousands of years without degradation. And yet the Maya built their entire cosmology around it. Their long count is not a simple tally of days. It is a cosmic timer, a way to track the slow dance of the equinox against the backdrop of the Milky Way. To do this without telescopes feels impossible. To do it without outside influence feels improbable. Consider Venus. The Maya tracked its synodic cycle 584 days, with an accuracy that over 5 centuries deviates by only a few hours from modern calculations. They charted Mars, too, capturing its retrograde motion even though it occurs only every couple of years. They mapped solar eclipses, lunar nodes, and even the dark rift of the galaxy, a silent river of dust that we could not describe scientifically until the advent of optical astronomy. Why Venus? Why Mars? Why such obsession with planetary behavior that did not directly affect agriculture or weather? Because planets move with intention, predictable, measurable, repeatable. They are the perfect celestial instruments for beings who wish to encode knowledge or messages visible from the ground. If you were an advanced civilization wanting to leave a blueprint for the cosmos to a developing society, you would not carve it in fragile codices. You would carve it into the sky through cycles no one could ignore. And that is exactly what the Maya appeared to have inherited. Their calendar was not just practical, it was architectural. Entire cities aligned with celestial markers, ceremonies synchronized with configurations of Venus. Pyramids became observatories not because it was symbolic, but because it was functional. Time was not measured, it was engineered, and if you stand on the summit of certain temples during specific dates, something uncanny occurs. The sunrise, moonrise, or starlight aligns perfectly with a window, a stairway, or a carved glyph, as though the structure was not built merely to honor the heavens, but to interact with them. The Maya did not just track time, they participated in it. But the mystery deepens further when we consider the galactic alignment associated with the end of the long count cycle. On the winter solstice of 2012, the sun rose in conjunction with the dark rift, the Mayas, symbolic cosmic womb. For them, this was not destruction but rebirth, the turning of a great wheel. Yet how could a society without precision instruments predict such an alignment thousands of years in advance? Even modern astronomers, with all their technology, consider the calculations challenging. So how did the Maya know? Did they infer it from centuries of observation? That explanation satisfies some, but the implication is almost more staggering. A civilization with no metal tools, no wheel, no centralized empire, and no apparent mechanism for long-term institutional knowledge, somehow maintained a perfect astronomical memory for millennia, unless the knowledge did not originate with them. When the Maya speak of their teachers, they never describe wandering philosophers or earthly kings. They describe beings who came from above, sometimes feathered, sometimes radiant, always tied to the stars. Their myths insist the calendar was given, not invented. And perhaps this is the detail mainstream scholarship hesitates to consider. What if they meant it literally? What if the long count is not human ingenuity, but legacy? A legacy passed down by visitors whose relationship with time extended far beyond human perception. Imagine a civilization capable of crossing interstellar distances. Time would not be linear to them. They would need to understand cycles, stellar cycles, galactic cycles, gravitational cycles. The Maya calendar may have been less a religious tool and more a simplified copy of a cosmological manual, a user's guide for the rhythms of the solar neighborhood. If this idea feels too large, consider how the calendar shaped the Maya world. Every ritual, every coronation, every prophecy, every war, all synchronized to celestial mechanics, as though they were waiting for something, watching for something, expecting a recurrence. Because cycles imply return, and return implies visitor. Suddenly Paco's upward journey and Chichén Itzá, his descending serpent, no longer feel isolated. They become entries in a cosmic journal, markers along a timeline measured not in centuries, but in backtons. The Maya were not merely recording time, they were anticipating something within it. Which brings us to the real question beneath their mathematics. What did they believe would return at the end of a great cycle? A god? A teacher? A skyfarer? A civilization? The staircase of Copán may be scrambled, but the calendar is precise, unyielding, intentional. And now it becomes the fourth point on our silent map, connecting Palenque's ascent, Chichén Itzá's descent, and Copán's fractured chronicle into a single shape, one that arcs upward, outward, toward the stars. But there is a place on Earth where this arc collides with another timeline altogether, timeline far older than the Maya, far older than humanity. A place where a cosmic event reshaped the world, erased entire species, and left a scar beneath the very cities that would one day decode the heavens. And the coincidence is too large to ignore. There are places on Earth where the past feels thin, so thin, you can almost see through it, as if time itself never fully healed from something unimaginable. The Yucatan Peninsula is one of those places. Stand anywhere along its limestone plains, feel the ground under your feet, and you are standing on the rim of an ancient wound. Not a metaphorical wound, not a poetic one, but a literal scar, left by an object that fell from the sky with force enough to end an age. 66 million years ago, a rock 6 miles wide plunged into what is now the Gulf of Mexico. The impact released more energy than all nuclear weapons on Earth combined. It darkened the sky, boiled the oceans, erased entire ecosystems, and ended the reign of creatures that had dominated the world for over 150 million years. It was the Chicxulub impact, one of the most destructive events in planetary history. Yet out of all the places on Earth, it was here, on this very scar, that one of humanity's most astronomically advanced civilizations eventually emerged. The Maya did not merely inhabit the region, they thrived here, building cities, observatories, temples, and calendars that seemed uncannily preoccupied with the sky. You could call it coincidence that the ground zero of extinction became a cradle of cosmic awareness. But the coincidence is so sharp, so improbable, that it begins to feel deliberate. Geologists who map the subterranean ring of cenote sinkholes, created by the shock wave of the ancient impact, are often stunned by what they find. The cenotes form a nearly perfect circle, the size of a nation's capital region. And scattered along this ring sit some of the Maya's most important ceremonial centers: Chichén Itzá, Ancivil-Chaltún, Aljuxmolan, Mayapan. As if their ancestors could sense something about this land, something magnetic, energetic, aligned. To the Maya, Cenotes were portals to the underworld, entrances to realms where gods spoke and ancestors dwelled. But imagine what it means when hundreds of these portals sit precisely along the boundary of an impact crater that reshaped the entire planet. The Maya did not know the science, but they felt the significance. They treated this land as sacred, charged, cosmically chosen. But the mystery deepens further when we consider the artwork of Mesoamerica, especially the depictions that resemble creatures long extinct. The Olmecs carved colossal stone heads with feline features mixed with something reptilian. The Maya painted serpent birds with scale patterns. Even the Aztec codices include creatures with shapes strikingly similar to dinosaurs, not accurate down to the bone, but evocative enough to raise a question. Were these purely mythological, or were they echoes of something embedded deep within the geological memory of the land? Skeptics dismiss this connection out of hand. They argue that cultural imagination is universal, and that dragons, serpents, and monsters appear in every mythos. But here, in the shadow of the Chicxulub crater, such imagery becomes more than folkloric coincidence. It becomes atmospheric, geological, an echo of a wound so ancient and so cataclysmic that the land itself seems to whisper fragments of its own trauma. Yet the most unsettling part of the story is not the impact itself, but what it suggests. Because if an asteroid was responsible for the last great extinction, then the Maya were living atop the epicenter of a cosmic event, a place where Earth's history intersected violently with the heavens. And perhaps, consciously or not, they built their cosmology around the idea that the sky does not merely illuminate life, it decides it. But what does this have to do with visitors? Step back, look at the world through the eyes of beings with interstellar awareness. If you were monitoring a developing planet, watching its cycles, its catastrophes, its recoveries, where would you place your instruments, your observation posts, your points of contact? At the site of a cataclysm, at a wound visible from orbit, at a crater whose geometry and mineral signatures could be detected from light years away. The Chicxulub impact reset Earth's biosphere. It altered climate trajectories, it reshaped coastlines. Its signature in the planet's strata is unmistakable. To a spacefaring civilization, it would mark Earth like a beacon. Here is where the old world ended, and the new world began. And what emerged after millions of years? Humans. Humans who eventually built temples atop the crater's rim. Humans who became obsessed with cycles of destruction and renewal. Humans who watched the skies with a precision that seemed to anticipate cosmic rhythms far beyond simple agricultural needs. If the Maya were visited or taught, this would be the place such encounters would logically occur. A place where the memory of extinction intersects with the rise of consciousness. A place that already bore the imprint of a celestial intervention, albeit in devastating form. But consider this twist. What if the Maya were not only observers of the sky, but inheritors of a warning? Their myths speak repeatedly of ages destroyed by fire and flood, of cycles ending abruptly, of worlds erased and rebuilt. Their gods, especially those linked to stars, often arrive with messages about balance, disturbance, or cosmic timing. This is not the language of simple myth-making. This is the language of a civilization aware that the universe is not always benevolent. And so, the fifth point on our silent map takes shape, a point where destruction and creation overlap, a point where ancient contact becomes intertwined with planetary trauma, a point where the Maya's astronomical obsession merges with a geological scar that should not have been forgotten but somehow was remembered. Because what are the odds that one of the greatest skywatching civilizations in history would emerge at the precise site where the sky last changed the fate of Earth? Coincidence can only stretch so far before it becomes pattern. Pattern can only repeat so often before it becomes message. And message can only be ignored for so long before it becomes prophecy. But the Maya were not the only ones to build atop a mystery. Not the only ones to carve cosmic knowledge into their architecture. Not the only ones whose cities hint at influence beyond human hands. Far to the west, in the shadow of volcanoes and under the weight of millennia, stands a metropolis that behaves as though it was built not for humans, but by something far older, far stranger, and far less interested in leaving its name behind. Teotihuacán awaits. By the time you reach the Valley of Mexico, surrounded by volcanic silhouettes and a horizon that seems too wide for its own secrets, you begin to understand why Teotihuacán unnerves historians more than any other ancient site in the Americas. It is not simply old, it is not simply vast, it is not simply enigmatic, it is silent. And silence, when it concerns a city built for more than 100,000 people, is always suspicious. Imagine approaching it for the first time. A sprawling stone metropolis emerges from the dust, aligned with such geometric discipline that it looks less like an ancient settlement and more like a blueprint, executed design rather than an evolved one. The Avenue of the Dead cuts through its heart like a runway, flanked by platforms, plazas, and pyramids so enormous that they dwarf nearly everything constructed in the Western Hemisphere before the modern era. It is a city planned with the precision of a single mind. And yet, no one, no king, no priest, no dynasty ever signed their name to it. No royal tombs, no victory inscriptions, no carved stele of triumph, nothing. It is the only great civilization in Mesoamerica that left behind monumental architecture but absolutely no written history of who built it. The Aztecs found it already abandoned 1,000 years before their rise. They gave it the name Teotihuacán, the place where gods were born, because to stand before its pyramids was to feel the weight of something beyond human ambition. They believed giants, or gods themselves, constructed it. Later, myth suggested it was where the sun and moon were forged, where creation itself began. But the archaeological record only deepens the mystery. Teotihuacán appears almost fully formed around the 1st century CE, as if it erupted, not evolved. There are no smaller precursor settlements, no gradual transition from village to city. The earliest construction we find is already monumental, and the layout, it is not the messy sprawl of a civilization learning to build. It is an engineered grid, rotated 15.5 degrees east of true north, not randomly, but aligned with key astronomical events involving the Pleiades and the solar zenith passages unique to this latitude. This is not urban planning. This is astronomical architecture on an urban scale. And then there is the Pyramid of the Sun, its base nearly identical in size to the Great Pyramid of Giza, without the wheel, without metal tools, without draft animals. To imagine ordinary human laborers lifting over 1 million cubic meters of stone into such perfect form is to imagine a contradiction. The Maya, at least, recorded who their kings were and why they built. Teotihuacán did neither. It simply exists, a masterpiece without a signature. But absence can speak louder than presence. A city with no kings could mean a collective council, a priesthood, or something more radical, administrators who had no need for human recognition. A city with no inscriptions could mean the ruling class did not write, or did not need to write. A city with no evolution could mean planning from above, not from within. And a city with such astronomical alignment could mean knowledge that did not originate here. One of the few clues lies at the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. Unlike the other pyramids, its facade bursts with carved serpent heads, open-mouthed, fierce, repeating endlessly like a coded message etched in stone. And beneath this pyramid in 2003, a sudden sinkhole opened the door to one of the most astonishing discoveries in modern archaeology. A sealed tunnel stretching 340 feet directly under the structure, filled with offerings and artifacts untouched for nearly 2 millennia. Explorers sent a small robot Lalok 2T sign to the darkness. Its cameras revealed something no one expected. Hundreds of shimmering golden spheres scattered across the chamber floor. They were not metal. They were clay spheres coated in jarosite, a mineral that forms in the presence of pyrite fool's gold. In torchlight they would have glowed like miniature planets. The walls themselves were coated with metallic, dust hematite, magnetite, and pyrite, ground to a powder so fine that the chamber would have sparkled like a field. Standing inside it would feel like floating in a constructed cosmos. An artificial universe beneath a pyramid. The official explanation calls it a ritual space, a symbolic representation of the underworld. But the precision. The spheres arranged like celestial bodies, the straight-cut tunnel running exactly along the city's sacred axis, it all feels like more than metaphor. If the Maya encoded astronomical cycles into their pyramids, Teotihuacán encoded the cosmos itself underground. Some researchers suggest the spheres might represent planets. Others propose they are relics of an initiation ceremony. But the ancient astronaut perspective asks a more provocative question. Was this chamber a teaching room? A briefing chamber? A place where beings, whether priests or something else, modeled the heavens for human initiates? Because if you were going to instruct a civilization in astronomy, navigation, or cosmic orientation, wouldn't you begin beneath the earth, in a chamber illuminated like the night sky? The tunnel is older than the pyramid above it, meaning the pyramid was built around the tunnel. Meaning whatever that chamber was, it mattered more than the monument covering it. And then, there is the most disturbing revelation: Teotihuacán might have collapsed from within. Around 550 CE, key structures along the Avenue of the Dead were deliberately burned. Temples smashed. Statues toppled. This was not an invading army, it was an uprising. A revolt? Against what? A priesthood that had lost its power. A ruling class that no longer held the city together. Or something more haunting. A civilization built around a presence that vanished. Imagine a society designed for a purpose, maintaining rituals, studying the sky, sustaining a grid of monuments, and then imagine the architects of that purpose leaving. Over generations, the knowledge erodes, the order collapses, the people revolt, the city dies. Teotihuacán then becomes not just a ruin, it becomes a question. What kind of civilization can build a city so perfect, so vast, so silent, and then disappear without a trace? Whatever the answer is, it leads us toward a figure who appears across Mesoamerica like a shadow cast by a single light source, being both serpent and man, both sky and earth, both myth and memory. His name changes from culture to culture, but his story does not. Quetzalcoatl awaits. When civilizations separated by mountains, languages, and centuries tell the same story, you have only two choices: dismiss it as coincidence, or treat it as memory. And in Mesoamerica, one memory returns again and again, like a quiet refrain. Carried across jungles, valleys, and empires, the memory of a feathered serpent who descended from the heavens, taught humanity, ruled with wisdom, and then vanished with a promise to return. His names shift across the map. Kukulkan, in the Yucatan, Quetzalcoatl among the Aztec Cucamats in the highlands of Guatemala, but the identity never changes. A serpent creature of the earth adorned with feathers, symbol of the sky, a being that is simultaneously of the ground and above it, a paradox rendered divine. To call Quetzalcoatl a god is true in myth. To call him a visitor is true in theory. But to call him a teacher, that is where the stories all converge. The Mayas say he brought mathematics, calendars, and astronomy. The Aztecs say he taught agriculture, healing, and architecture. Others say he ended human sacrifice and reshaped their rites, civilizer, navigator, sky being, but also Sratinia man. This duality is the heart of the mystery. In most depictions, Quetzalcoatl appears in two forms, the feathered serpent streaking across the sky, and the tall, light-skinned, bearded man clothed in flowing robes. Why would Mesoamerican cultures whose people did not grow beards describe a divine figure with distinctly non-native features? And more curiously, why would they describe him arriving from the east, across the water, and leaving the same way? Unless they were not describing a mythological transformation at all, but two aspects of a single event, the serpent as the craft that descended from the sky, the man as the pilot who stepped out of it, the feathers representing propulsion, light, or a shimmering field of energy, the serpent form representing movement, flexibility, flight. To ancient eyes, a streamlined metallic craft might well look like a serpent gliding through the air. To ancient storytellers, the roar of descent might translate to the hiss of a celestial dragon. And at Chichén Itzá, the pyramid of Kukulkan reenacts his descent every equinox with a serpent made of pure light and shadow, a precise astronomical projection embedded into stone architecture. Not metaphor, but mechanism. For one brief moment, as the sun reaches the perfect angle, the serpent appears to slide down from the heavens to meet its carved stone head at the base of the pyramid. It is a replay, a permanent recording etched into sunlight and shadow, of something the ancients wanted desperately not to forget. But if the Maya remembered his descent, the Aztec remembered something else's promise. He would return. That single prophecy shaped an empire. It shaped their worldview, their politics, their religion, and it shaped their downfall. In Iwo when Hernan Cortes landed with his min armor gleaming, beards full, arriving from the east, on the very year tied to Quetzalcoatl's return, the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma hesitated. They did not see invaders. They saw a prophecy fulfilled. That is how powerful the memory was. A figure from the sky, who came as light, as serpent, as man. The ancient astronaut perspective sees the story with chilling clarity. A visitor arrives using technology indistinguishable from divine power. A craft appears as a radiant serpent, perhaps glowing or shimmering in descent. The pilot emerges, teaching knowledge far beyond the era's capabilities. When he departs, he ascends again, transforming from man to serpent of light. And the myths blur the two into a single being. But this is not the only culture that sees serpents as messengers of the sky. Across the ocean, in the rocky highlands of Greece, the dragon houses of Euboea stand on mountain tops like stone beacons. Built with cyclopean blocks and corbelled ceilings, they are feats of construction whose purpose remains unknown. Local legends say they were built by a draken, not a monster, but a divine, powerful being associated with Zeus. The word dragon in ancient Greek did not mean a winged beast. It meant a serpent-like sky being, a watcher, a bringer of power, a serpent descending from the heavens, a divine being teaching and departing, a mountaintop landing place, a stone structure marking the event. It is the same story, different continent, different language, same archetype. And this is where the pattern becomes too clean to ignore. The feathered serpent in Mexico, the dragon of Euboea, the NGAs of India, serpents who arrive from the heavens, the Chinese long sky dragons who teach emperors, the aboriginal rainbow serpent bringer of law and life, cultures that never met, civilizations separated by oceans. Yet they all describe an entity that is not entirely creature, not entirely machine, not entirely God, a being, a serpent of light, a visitor who comes, teaches, and promises to return. Even the symbolism is consistent, the merging of heaven and earth, the union of knowledge and power, the bridging of two realms. The serpent embodies the terrestrial world. The feathers, wings, or radiance embody the celestial. The message embedded in these myths is not fear, it is instruction, a kind of cosmic syllabus scattered across continents. Humanity did not simply worship these beings. Humanity learned from them. But the most startling detail is this. Quetzalcoatl's descent and ascent are not described as miracles. They are described as movements, actions, processes. He arrives in the sky. He descends. He interacts. He departs. None of this is poetic imagery. These are technical descriptions rendered in symbolic language. A serpent flies. A man arrives. A civilization changes. A prophecy begins. Some will insist this is myth-making at its most creative. Yet when cultures separated by entire oceans tell the same story, we must ask, are they all remembering the same event? The same beings, the same era of contact? Because Quetzalcoatl is not merely a character in myth, he is a template, a blueprint, a global phenomenon wrapped in local language. And if the story appears in Mesoamerica and Greece, What does that imply? That the memory is broader than one region, that the visitors traveled farther than one land, that humanity's forgotten history is not isolated, is shared. And the next ancient clue lies not in jungles or myths, but in stone houses perched on a Greek mountaintop, a place where the sky once touched the earth, and a serpent of power etched its presence into the rocks themselves. The story continues across oceans, because Quetzalcoatl was never alone. High above the Aegean Sea, on the rugged island of Euboea, the wind moves differently. It travels across stone the way memory travels across time, slowly, insistently, carrying traces of something older than myth itself. On this island stand 25 megalithic structures unlike anything else in Greece. They are called Dracospatae dragon houses. The name alone seems fantastical, but the structures are not fantasy. They are real stone buildings, each assembled from multi-ton limestone slabs fitted so tightly without mortar that even modern tools struggle to replicate the precision. Their roofs are built using a corbelled technique that forms a vault, much like a reversed stairway of stone converging overhead. They sit on mountaintops, often more than 1,000 meters above sea level. Why would anyone drag 10-ton blocks up a mountain to build rooms with no inscriptions, no altars, no artwork, and no apparent utility? Archaeology calls them shelters or shrines. Myth calls them the work of dragons. But myth, when examined closely, is rarely naive. In ancient Greek, the word draken did not refer to the winged monsters of medieval imagination. A draken was a being of immense power and sharp sight, often associated with gods who traversed the sky. Dragons were watchers, guardians, sky beings. They were frequently linked to Zeus, the thunder-wielding ruler, who drove his chariot across the heavens. One legend on Euboea says the dragon houses were built by a draken who served Zeus himself. The creature descended upon Mount Oki, constructed a monumental stone house, and used it as a dwelling or a station during the god's visits. The location is striking. Mount Oki is a place where the horizon is endless, where the sky feels impossibly close. A place ideal for landing, a place ideal for watching, and suddenly the myths shift in meaning. Zeus descending may not be a metaphor. The dragon building may not be a fable. The stone house may not be a shrine. What if it was a landing site? When you strip away cultural interpretation, the story aligns perfectly with ancient astronaut logic. A sky being descends. Its companion or vehicle constructs a structure quickly, using unimaginable power. The structure endures through millennia. The locals, unable to explain such engineering, attribute it to divine beings. The parallels to Mesoamerica become almost unsettling. In Mexico, Quetzalcoatl is a feathered serpent who descends from the sky. In Greece, a draken descends alongside Zeus. In both cases, the being teaches, governs, or transforms the land. In both cases, a monumental stone structure marks the event. In both cases, the structure's purpose remains obscured and inexplicable to modern archaeology. Two cultures separated by oceans, two architectural anomalies, two sky serpents, one pattern, but the mystery deepens when we examine the stonework itself. The dragon houses were built using enormous blocks with no adhesives, similar to the megalithic precision of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, or the trilithons of Baalbek in Lebanon. The corbelled vaulting resembles early Mycenaean structures, yet the overall style appears older, stranger, and without clear lineage. No tools, no quarries, no nearby settlements explain how they were constructed. It is as if these structures were not built by the people of the region, but left for them. The resemblance to Mesoamerican anomalies becomes impossible to overlook. At Teotihuacán, who built the city? We do not know. At Euboea, who built the dragon houses? We do not know. At Chichén Itzá, the serpent descends in light. At Mount Oki, the serpent descends as a dracon. At Palenque, a king rides a flaming starship into the heavens. In Greek myth, Zeus descends on beams of lightning, and his companions build impossible structures. The symbolism overlaps so precisely that it suggests not independent invention, but shared memory. Imagine the world thousands of years ago, not isolated cultures, but scattered human groups witnessing similar events and describing them with the vocabulary available to them. A flying serpent in the Yucatan becomes a feathered god. A gleaming craft descending in Greece becomes a dragon. The architect of Teotihuacán becomes a faceless deity. The builders of the dragon houses become supernatural giants. Different stories, same structure, same vocabulary of Quetzalcoatl arrives from the east, Zeus arrives from above. The serpent in Maya cosmology is a bridge between worlds. The dragon in Greek lore is a guardian at the threshold of realms. What if the beings depicted across these myths were not separate characters, but part of a singular phenomena, a global presence remembered differently in different regions? And then there is the most compelling detail of all. Both the dragon houses and Teotihuacán's pyramids are aligned to celestial events. The dragon house on Mount Oki is aligned with the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, a star worshipped, observed, and mythologized in cultures from Egypt to Polynesia. It is the star associated with Osiris, with rebirth, with cosmic kingship. In the Maya worldview, Sirius is tied to cycles of renewal and destruction. a star whose connections extend across continents, a star treated as a marker of divine arrival. The builders of the dragon houses cared about the sky, not metaphorically, mathematically, just as the Maya cared about Venus, just as the builders of Teotihuacán cared about the Pleiades, just as the myths of Quetzalcoatl cared about the morning star. The sky is the common language. So what do we have? A feathered serpent descending from the heavens in Mexico, a dragon descending to a mountaintop in Greece, both leaving behind architecture beyond the capabilities of their time, both connected to stars, timing, and celestial precision, both worshipped not as monsters, but as teachers, both promising to return. And if the same story appears in Greece and Mesoamerica, how many more places around the world bear the same signature? The serpent, the dragon, the ski bean? China has its celestial dragons, India, its Nga and Vimana, Egypt, its winged sun, the Dogon of Mali, their visitors from Sirius. A global tapestry emerges, not myth, memory, and like all memories, it is fragmented but still recognizable. The dragons of Greece are not merely relics of a local legend. They are a continuation of the same narrative that appears in the Yucatan, in Teotihuacán, in Palenque. A narrative that suggests Earth may once have been part of a larger conversation, one recorded in stone, encoded in myth, and still visible to those who know where to look. One final thread remains: the erasure, because for every monument that survives, another was destroyed. For every myth that endured, a book was burned. And nowhere is this more visible than in the tragedy that befell the Maya's sacred codices, the very documents that may once have preserved the truth in unambiguous detail. The story of that erasure is the next chapter, and it is darker than anything carved in stone. Before we follow the story forward, we must confront the moment where the story almost ended, the moment when the memory of an entire civilization was deliberately thrown into fire. Not metaphorically, literally. In 1562, in a town called Mahani, a Spanish friar named Diego de Landa carried out one of the most devastating acts of cultural destruction the Western Hemisphere had ever seen. He gathered the Maya's sacred codicized books made of bark, paper coated in lime, filled with astronomical tables, dynastic records, medicinal knowledge, rituals, and myth sand. He burned them in a single inferno so hot that witnesses said the sky itself darkened. Only four codices survived. For, from thousands, the Maya spent centuries perfecting a written tradition, unlike anything else in the ancient world. They carved history into stone, painted it onto pottery, etched it into bone, and folded it into books. Those books contained their explanation of the world, their understanding of the heavens, their record of the beings who came before them, beings they never called mythological, but always gods, teachers, serpents of the sky. And in one night, that knowledge was reduced to ash. The official justification was religious purification, an attempt to erase idolatry, but the deeper implication is far more unsettling, because if the codices had simply contained rituals or poetry, they would not have threatened the church. What threatened the church was the cosmology, the mathematics, the astronomy, the records of cycles measured in tens of thousands of years, the depictions of gods who arrived not from afterlife realms, but from the sky, the possibility terrifying to a theological empire that humanity was not alone, that divine messengers were not angels, and that the universe was far larger and more populated than doctrine allowed. If even one codex had contained explicit diagrams of the Palenque craft, or the descent of Kukulkan, or the star maps the Maya claimed were gifts from their gods, then the world the Spanish believed they were defending would have cracked open from the inside. Perhaps that is why the codices burned. But fire can only erase paper. It cannot erase stone. And beneath the stone, beneath the roots of ancient ceiba trees, lay another archive, one the conquerors never imagined. An archive made of earth, not ink. For centuries, dense jungles swallowed the Maya world, hiding entire cities, pyramids, and roads beneath a canopy so thick that even modern explorers believed only a fraction of the civilization had ever been found. But today, we possess a new kind of vision, not the vision of the gods, but something astonishingly close. LiDAR, a light that cuts through leaves, a tool that peels away the forest like a veil, and with it, the past began to rise again. When researchers scanned 800 square miles of Guatemalan jungle, they expected a handful of small settlements. Instead, LiDAR revealed more than 60,000 unknown stratifications, canals, terraces, pyramids, reservoirs, watchtowers, industrial zones, and a web of stone highways engineered so precisely that some stretch arrows straight across terrain for miles. The Maya had not lived in isolated kingdoms. They had built a megalopolitic civilization equal in scale to ancient China or Rome, a civilization supported by mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and agriculture that now appears far beyond what was believed possible for their era. LiDAR was not just revealing buildings. It was revealing a systema, unified, coherent blueprint beneath the chaos of time. But then came the strangest revelation of all. Teotihuacán, a city already steeped in mystery, contained a district unmistakably Maya, not culturally similar, not influenced, but Maya-built, a diplomatic neighborhood in the heart of a foreign metropolis. Two great civilizations thought to be separate were connected by roads, trade, politics, and perhaps by something deeper, who linked them, who coordinated knowledge across hundreds of miles of jungle and mountains, who seeded the same myths, the same symbols, the same obsessions with stars and cycles. The past, once blurry, now sharpened into a pattern. Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, the dragon of Greece, the serpent of India, the teachers across continents. Different names, same template. And suddenly, the destruction of the codices no longer looks like an isolated act of religious violence. It looks like the attempted silencing of a global memory, a memory that humanity was taught, uplifted, guided by beings who came from the sky. But LiDAR, satellites, and precision archaeology are undoing that silence. Stone by stone, structure by structure, the old world is reassembling itself. Now, as we stand in this moment between the ruins of forgotten cities and the rise of technologies capable of unveiling them, it becomes clear that the story is not finished. In fact, it is only now becoming readable. The ancient world is no longer a distant place behind us. It is a mirror held to our face. With every buried pyramid revealed by lasers, with every tunnel reopened beneath Teotihuacán, with every fragment of glyph deciphered, we inch closer to understanding something humanity has sensed, but never proven for thousands of years. We are part of a larger narrative. We were not the first to look up and receive an answer, and we may not be the last. The Maya spoke of cycles, of worlds ending and beginning, of visitors who arrived when the sky aligned. The Greeks spoke of dragons and gods who descended on mountains. The Aztecs waited for a teacher who promised to return, and across the world, architecture points upward, as if all civilizations longed for the same horizon. Tonight, as this story settles into you, allow it to breathe. Allow it to open gently, like a doorway you are not yet meant to enter. The truth of our origins may be vast, overwhelming, even frightening. But it is also beautiful because it means we belong to something far greater than the small histories written in our modern books. And if the past holds visitors, teachers, or celestial architects, then perhaps the future does too. For now, the jungle continues to whisper, the stones continue to speak, and the sky ever patient waits for us to finally understand.